In this video, I will briefly touch on the infrastructure for the airline industry and also the cost structure, as well as making rates within this mode of transportation. Okay, let's think about the infrastructure for a second. Who actually pays to create the infrastructure? Well, as far as the airways go, air is, free to make, basically, right? You don't have to create any kind of roads. You don't have to create any kind of rail system out there. So the airspace, in that sense, is free. So the only real infrastructure expenses that you have are the airports, right? Airports, you can think of these as terminals. Previously, when talking about motor carriers, we talked about terminals. So airports, in a way, are terminals for this mode of transportation. Who pays for the airports? Government, us, the taxpayers. All right. So the government, both local, state, and even federal government, invest and operate airports and oversee the airways. Okay. Certain airports, obviously, if you traveled already by plane, you have probably noticed that certain airports have, terminals, whole terminals, big buildings that are dedicated to possibly even just one airline carrier, right? So these terminals within the airport become major hubs for certain carriers. Now, does that mean that they actually own these terminals? No, they pretty much lease the terminal, number of gates that they need, and all services associated with such a hub. So air carriers pay for the use of the airport through such fees as landing fees, rent, and lease payments for the space, obviously, for usually number of gates that you will require. And just like with any other business, if you purchase or if you lease in bulk, you'll get a little bit better rate, right? So again, airlines that operate on a large scale of economies tend to benefit even here when it comes to the fees that they have to pay for rent and lease. Taxes on fuel and ticketing. Let's see, also aircraft registration taxes. Just like registering a vehicle, aircraft is also a type of vehicle, so aircraft also experiences registration taxes. Right, and then you have all these additional services that are offered at any given terminal at the airport. Right, these could be just having clean restrooms, gift shops, restaurants, conveniences of today's life. So all these things cost money, and eventually these kind of expenses translate into some fees that the carriers have to absorb. Ultimately, us, the end users, or the businesses that use airlines for cargo purposes. So if you purchased an airplane ticket online or just really anywhere, and you see the itemized costs that go into the final price, you will notice that often more than half of the price that you paid is for all kinds of fees and taxes, and just being able to use some of the terminal amenities there, right? So that's kind of almost weird to believe that only 40 to 50% of that final price is for the actual transport itself. All right, so that's as far as the infrastructure, right? So it's obviously based on this, what I just mentioned here, as far as who pays for the infrastructure, who builds it, and what parts of the infrastructure have to be built in the first place, right? If you would think about the cost structure breakdown of this mode of transportation and thinking about variable cost versus fixed costs, what would you say? Is this a variable cost heavy kind of mode of transportation, or is it more heavy on the fixed cost side? So because there's not a whole lot of infrastructure that's required, right, and the airlines themselves don't have to build airports, because of that, fixed costs are pretty low, right? So the fixed costs on average are somewhere around 20% out of the total cost structure, and variable costs are obviously 80%, plus or minus, of course, few percentages, but 80-20 breakdown works well to describe this mode of transportation. Yeah, so just to briefly highlight on a few points here. So again, the reason why the 20% is the number here and the fixed cost is much lower is because the infrastructure out there is being publicly provided, right? So public, or the government, if you will, pays for the infrastructure. right, and maintains its operation. Now, the variable costs, airport and airway usage fees, right? This is all kinds of fees that you can think of when it comes to just using the airport and flying around in the U.S. Airspace. This would be very much a variable cost translated into these fees. Then you have fuel. Right? Fuel accounts for about 34% of all the costs for airlines. Labor. Labor is about a quarter, so 25%. Right, and there are a couple other operating kind of costs that we could possibly mention. So let's just put operating cost here. Right, so depending on what kind of aircraft you're using, for example, that will determine how many crew members do you need, how many passengers you can transport, what's the maximum weight that you could load on any given airplane, right? What distances you're traveling and so on. So these are some additional operating costs that are still variable costs, but may differ depending on what kind of equipment you're using. Okay. Now, when it comes to rates, let's talk a little bit about rates. We're going to talk about passenger and cargo a little bit separately. Passenger and cargo rate making or pricing. Okay. So when it comes to passenger pricing, predominantly these days, if not exclusively, it's really based on discount pricing techniques. Okay, and the famous discount pricing technique out there that's being used, it's the dynamic pricing. And again, I mentioned this in a previous video. I will post a YouTube video that will illustrate what this dynamic pricing is all about. But in a nutshell, it uses various variables based on consumers' purchasing habits of airplane tickets, and it adjusts the prices of seats pretty much on kind of minute by minute basis, almost, if not in real time, right? So depending on the time and day of departure, or return, right, you will pay different prices. That makes sense, right? If you want to fly Monday morning, most likely you're going to experience higher prices because lots of business people fly at that time. Time of ticket purchase. Right, so actually, are you looking at tickets during the weekend or are you looking at tickets during weekdays? There's some statistics that shows that if you're looking at for airplane tickets during the weekdays, again, you may see a little bit higher prices because way more people are looking during that time period from Monday to Friday. Again, because mostly you are competing with business people that need to go to their meetings and meet with their business partners. If you look during the weekend, you have a better chance of securing a little bit lower rate because the airline companies also realize that whoever's looking during the weekend, they're most likely looking for vacation kind of purposes, flying. Now, even within the week, there's all kinds of statistics out there that you can look at, but supposedly Tuesday and Thursday are better days to look at airplane tickets as far as pricing goes than some of the other Monday, Wednesday, Friday days during the weekdays. But again, this is very much a dynamic pricing. So even, this may be true this year, next year, something completely different may happen based on how the market behaves. Level of service. Right, so obviously, if you need first class or coach, or you just want a little bit of that extra leg space, it's going to cost you, right? So your price is going to adjust based on that. But even within, coach, you have lots of dynamic pricing taking place based on all these other variables, and the formula may be a little bit different than if you're looking for tickets within first class. We don't need to get into the specific of math specific behind this. Advanced ticket purchases. So if I'm buying well in advance, I may get some price discount. But buying way too in advance can also be disadvantageous because airlines cannot predict what the market will do 1 year from now. So just in case, they're erring on the side of I'm going to charge you a little bit more, just in case the fuel prices will go way up or the economy will improve and there's going to be larger demand, and therefore I will be able to charge more. So just to not lose the opportunity to make money, I am going to ask you for more money if you're looking for a ticket a year in advance. If you're looking for a ticket 3 months in advance, that may be kind of the sweet spot, especially when you're talking about international flights. I'm kind of speaking from even personal experience here. Domestic flights, supposedly the sweet spot is somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks prior to flying. And obviously, also the price will be affected by just competition out there. which route am I interested in? From which city to which city am I flying? What is the density of the population in this area, and so on. These things will ultimately determine the price. But pay attention to the word dynamic, right? And again, it just means that the prices can change from 1 minute to another. Okay? They adjust based on heavy calculus being working in the background. Yeah, please take a look at the video. It's nicely done. It's kind of fun to watch as well from one of the reporters he works for CNN, but also for other networks out there. On the cargo side, cargo pricing is dependent mainly on just weight and or, of course, cubic dimensions, right? So weight and cubic dimensions, okay? But then there can be other characteristics as well, depending on what kind of commodity you're transporting, how bulky it is, right? So any kind of over-dimension or over-dimensional type of charges may exist, again, depending on the bulkiness of your cargo. All right, so density, we can just call it density here. It matters. And then you have all kinds of various scenarios, special services. So to give you an example here, when I worked for Transcon Trading Company, the export management company, a lot of our business was dealing with the equine industry, the racehorses, and we would sell a lot of supplements to many of these. Even in Middle East, the racehorsing in Middle East is very popular. So specifically in UAE, to Dubai. Dubai was a really big business for us, and we worked directly with trainers that trained the horses for the royal family. And of course, in the U.S., Kentucky, right? That's a major location where this industry exists within the U.S. And some of the best horses come out of the facilities and the trainers in Kentucky. And so often you would have royal family, and that you don't deal directly with them, but their trainers who would request transportation of horses from Kentucky to Dubai. Now, when you think about transportation of horses, you probably imagine some kind of small space, right? Some kind of trailer that we often see out there on the interstates, behind a truck. Well, this was a quite different scenario. The royal family that actually sent an airplane that's dedicated for horse transportation, and basically the whole airplane would accommodate 3 or 4 horses, depending on what kind of airplane was sent in, and depending on how many horses they need to purchase. But you think first class on any kind of passenger airlines is amazing. If you would see these kind of stables within the airplane, it was something spectacular to see. Nice and clean, beautifully set up. I would prefer to fly in that stable rather than coach, I guess. Anyway, yeah, so all kinds of special services there, or even if you're transporting armed guards, right? Then you have certain accommodations that you have to provide for these guys and gals. Okay. And one more thing here. Let's talk about a couple of efficiency kind of measures that are often used in this mode of transportation. So the operating efficiency or operating ratio is something that is heavily considered. All right, so let's write it down. Operating ratio, or some people call it operating efficiency. And simply this is a simple formula here of operating expense divided by operating revenue, right? And then just multiply by 100 to give you a percentage. So basically this just tries to understand how effectively we're using our money, right? How much revenue are we producing based on what kind of expenses we have to produce that specific amount in revenue. And then more on the passenger side of things, we have load factor. It's somewhat similar, but just talks about people, right? So number of passengers and divided by total number of seats that are available. All right, so this is a total here. And again, just multiply by 100. All right, so ideally you want to utilize your airplanes to the fullest, because again, once the airplane takes off, if there's an empty seat, you're not going to recover that empty seat, okay? That capacity is lost forever. And so for this reason, there was big push in the late 80s and 90s to create these large hubs and less of them, so centralize the network as much as possible, have these large airports available. But clearly that can work only to a certain degree, and all of a sudden you will start losing the level of service that you're providing, right? The service will suffer if you just have in the extreme example, if you would have only, say, LA airport on the West Coast and New York, LaGuardia or JFK, whatever, airport on the East Coast, right? So having these two, sure, we will connect East Coast, West Coast, but then a bunch of people will have to travel through other modes of transportation to get to those airports, right? So that's a little bit of an inconvenience. This is an extreme kind of example that I'm painting here, but this would be very much consolidation of all the airports and creating just two major hubs. Even in the 90s, you have seen both Airbus and Boeing focusing on creating these humongous airplanes. And Airbus eventually, they had the biggest airplane that they created, but then at the same time, some of the materials that were used to build airplanes started to transition into some composite type of materials, and Boeing took advantage of just that. So Boeing stopped focusing on building large. Instead, Boeing created what is it, the famous airplane now, Boeing 747, I believe, right? So it's not the biggest airplane, but it's the most efficient as far as some of these ratios go. So lots of companies are purchasing Boeing today, and because of this innovation in composite materials, we're not suffering as far as too much consolidation going on and too many major hubs out there instead of having more airports on a regional basis. And that's where we are today as far as the infrastructure goes. Okay. Maybe one more thing worth mentioning also with consolidating too much and creating these large airplanes. Think about just the logistics of loading and unloading such airplanes, whether you're talking about cargo or people. Just the time component, the time and effort that it takes to utilize such an airplane to the fullest is much more significant than utilizing smaller airplanes, right? And so for that reason, some of the costs would be much higher if we would have very centralized type of network. So just to summarize, in the 80s and 90s, there was push for centralization because that's where the economies of scale were heading. That's what it looked like. That's where we need to go to be cost efficient. However, thanks to some innovation, specifically in the material science and some of these composite type of materials, we were able to back off from this complete extreme kind of centralization that I described, East Coast, West Coast. And rely on smaller airplanes, which are still more efficient as far as operating expenses go than some of the alternatives that were suggested. All right, so that completes the series of videos for the air mode of transportation. Please watch the additional video on dynamic pricing, and that completes this lecture.